Werewolves, slashers, sentient houses. Stephen Graham Jones has tackled them all. In his most recent novel, The Buffalo Hunter Hunter, he adds vampires to his already impressive list of literary monsters. Beginning in the early 1800s and nestled in a contemporary university frame story of an academic tenure process, the novel touches on the loss of community, the possibility of inherent guilt, and the construction of the truth via confession. Jones' novel develops as a triptych of confession. Etsy, an assistant communications professor, reveals her struggle with tenure and the possibility of salvation through her great-great-great-grandfather's lost journal. Author Beaucairn, Etsy's Tracel, works to absolve his own relation with the local Blackfeet tribe. And Goodstab, a reluctant vampire giving a confession, discloses the histories told and untold that bind these three narratives together.
Today on Horror Joy, we talk with Stephen Graham Jones about his latest novel, how community works both in the novel and among horror creators and fans, and how a novel shaped by confession reveals the inextricable link between joy and horror through the relationship among the characters, ourselves, and our histories. So grab a slice of your favorite confessional cake and join us as we talk horror, joy, and everything in between with Stephen Graham Jones. Be sure to keep your lanterns lit and your senses alert, lest the vampire come for you in the darkness. This is Horror Joy. We're your hosts. I'm Brian Onishi.
And I'm Jeff Stoyanoff. We're two professors celebrating the emotional and intellectual joys of horror.
All right, y'all. We are here with Stephen Graham Jones. Stephen Graham Jones, he's a New York Times bestselling author, recipient of the Bram Stoker Award, Shirley Jackson Award, National Endowment for the Arts. He's penned over 30 novels and collections, including, of course, The Only Good Indians, My Heart is a Chainsaw, and I Was a Teenage Slasher. His most recent novel, The Buffalo Hunter Hunter, was published in March of 2025 by Saga Press. Received his PhD from Florida State University, but more importantly, perhaps he received a master's in fine arts from the University of North Texas. Go Mean Green. Excited about that. That's where I got my PhD from. Stephen, we are so excited to have you on the pod today. Talk about relationships between joy and horror, your new book, everything else in between.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. And I like to talk to people who are into horror, man.
Yeah, and we're here for it. We're here for the joy.
Yeah.
And that's really where we want to jump off. We, of course,
Yeah.
our kind of whole thing right here is trying to figure out the relationship between joy and horror. For a lot of people, that relationship doesn't make sense. For a lot of people, I think it really does. So curious to know what your relationship looks like or what you think about the relationship between joy and horror, if there's joy to be found there.
I think there definitely is, or I felt it anyways. Maybe that makes me wrong or twisted or something. But if I am, then a lot of us are as well. Yeah, maybe for me to talk about joy and horror, like it feels like I first have to talk about joy just in the general sense, And I intentionally didn't look up the definition because I don't care what Merriam-Webster says, I feel like if I'm going to give like 3 examples of joy, then all 3 of those examples are going to be like, oh, my puppy was lost and I found my puppy, or I was lost in the woods and I found my truck. It's always about a return for some reason. I'm not sure why that is with joy. I mean, of course, a lot of horror is about the return of whatever, the repressed, justice, spirits of vengeance, whatever it is. But I don't think that's actually the association that explains it to me. What explains joy and horror to me, it's that thrill or rightness or beauty that you feel watching a scene, reading a scene, engaging some aspect of a horror story under the umbrella of this is fiction, So I can commit to like Jason at that bonfire party in Freddy versus Jason, where he's just carving through people, and one guy runs away and says that goalkeeper, that hockey player is really mad or whatever it is, and to me, that's just like a distillation of everything joyful in horror. And I'm not rooting for kids, teenagers, partiers to die. I'm rooting for Jason to keep doing what Jason does. And the joy comes from the fact that I know that these people aren't really dying, which I know that sounds like I'm subscribing to the horror as a roller coaster with the safety bar down. So you get to feel the thrill of death without actually engaging that kind of rip or anything. I subscribe to that, like, I don't know, 80%, but I really think horror has teeth as well. I think horror can open a door in your head that you can't close again. So I think like, a Serbian film or Girl Next Door, there's stuff that you engage it and you come out different and you realize afterwards there was no safety bar for that ride, you know? So I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that horror is always safe, but horror can be fun. And I think part of that fun is I think we just have some sort of shunt or mechanism in our head where we calve our joy off into a track or a run or a ditch that is like meaning doesn't matter. Not meaning doesn't matter, but consequences don't matter here, you know?
Yeah, I love everything you just said. I mean, I think one of the things that you said that's so compelling to me is the idea that joy, there's something about the return as being a kind of essential quality of joy, and how that plays into the horror experience, the lack of safety and that kind of thing. I think in part, I want to jump into this question, Jeff, if you don't mind. So the Buffalo Hunter is this kind of strange vampire story. It's incredibly written. I think the characters are amazing. And one of the things that I was thinking about, and I was listening to Hi-Fi Nation, which is a kind of philosophy podcast by Barry Lamb, but he explored this idea of vampires as a conversion mechanism. So thinking about this kind of leaving and returning in some way, the vampire as conversion, do you think this fits in with the Buffalo Hunter as, especially in the kind of religious context? There's a Lutheran pastor, all that kind of stuff, how we might think of the vampire here in the Buffalo Hunter as a kind of mechanism of conversion or something like that?
You know, if I understand correctly, the way that that person you were listening to was using conversion, it sounds like the vampire is a mechanism much like a possession story. Like it kind of scares you straight, you know, it scares you back into the church on Sunday morning. Is that the way he's using it? Or?
Yeah, more like there's a transformative change, right? So I don't think this is like, hey, you need to be set straight, or even you need to be X, Y, or Z, but that once you've done this thing, you've now entered into a different phase of life that you can't go back from, right? You've converted, and now it's a full conversion such that like you can't actually return anymore.
Yeah. It's like, I mean, you're driving along the road, you hit your first hitchhiker, and now you're a hitchhiker killer. You know, it's like for the rest of your life, I guess, right? So
yeah, I like that. That.
Yeah, I mean, I know. I guess I can understand it in that sense. For me, I don't read Buffalo Hunter as that, but you know, I should say too that what I say about Buffalo Hunter doesn't matter, because I don't think I'm just a person who has anecdotes about the writing of it. I don't really have any special insight into it. I don't feel like, you know, any intent I had is usually laughable. I just want to say things that are funny and bloody, you know, and sometimes they stick together, sometimes they don't. You know, I understand what that guy's saying as far as being like a prime part of the vampire story we usually hear, because Interview with a Vampire is really big on that. You know, when Louis finally decides to take a life instead of just eating rats, then he's on a different track forever. He's been converted to this other lifestyle this other life pattern where he is, you know, and his life is more important than his prey's life. And they're both people, so it's a complicated situation. But for me, Buffalo Hunter isn't that. What I was more concerned with the Buffalo Hunter was concepts of justice, fairness. Is sin inherited, or not sin? Is trauma? Not trauma. I guess trauma. Not really trauma. No, but is like something you did wrong. Is something your grandfather did wrong on you, basically.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to echo Brian's, like, just thank you so much for joining us. I got to see you read from Mongrels when you visited the University of South Alabama a few years back when I worked down in Mobile at a different college. It's great to get to talk to you. And the book Buffalo Hunter was phenomenal. Yeah, can't recommend it enough. But with this idea with conversion, one of the things that I picked up on a little bit we get in Good Stab's narrative is how he's changed, right? Like, I mean, obviously he's changed, but like he seems to have gained not just a new physical existence, but a new perspective on everything around him. I wonder if that's something ecological in a way. Like he's seeing how he was really connected to this land and now he's not anymore. There seems to be so much pain in that. And I just wondered, because you just talked about justice. So I'm curious if you were, you know, thinking about that when you're writing a character like Good Stab, or, you know, just your thoughts on that. Because I love that element of him.
I was definitely thinking about how can I hurt him more and more, you know, and the way I can hurt him more and more is take away more of the things that he thinks are vital, like his sense of being a tribal person, being part of a community, being a we instead of an I, you know? And so I had to take away from him horse riding, dreaming, being among his people in the camp, smoking pipes and hunting in the traditional way. I just had to take away everything that he identified himself as Blackfeet with, you know? And I mean, you probably can read that as ecological. I wasn't thinking of it as ecological, but I never think of things as, well, no, I've had one story, I guess, where I've thought of something as ecological, but I've heard people say about Only Good Indians that it has that same kind of push, the ecological push. And I say, sure, you know, but I don't know. I'm always afraid to tackle things that big, you know?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. The idea that the environment or nature, like an ecological kind of picture of horror feels really big. And I don't know, I got to do some work with Lovecraft, who of course has a lot of problems. And I don't know, I feel like every time you mention Lovecraft, you have to mention that, right? It's like take a step back a little bit. But the argument that was compelling to me by some of the people writing about Lovecraft is that like he went to New York and came back to Providence, and two things happened. He read Algernon Blackwood and like had this kind of ecological turn after reading Blackwood. And then once he did that, he kind of his cosmic horror took off. So he had this like big enough space to but in that sense too, right? There's this idea that nature ecologies get too broad and we don't actually have a good grasp of what they're doing. So like I think in part reading the Buffalo Hunter, maybe even the Only Good Indian, it's like it's a close-knit story that tells, right, something about like the land is such an important part of this. And right, it seems as though that's implicit, right? Even like you're saying, if it's not explicit, it feels like this kind of implicit character in the background that drives some of the stuff that's going on.
No, I agree. I mean, take the buffalo out of this landscape, it's a different landscape, you know? And that's what these people who were coming west were doing. They were intentionally taking the buffalo out, and the buffalo were still vital, keeping everything balanced, you know? But in that sense, yeah, definitely ecological. Like I was saying, I just never think in those terms, you know? So it's there. That's great. I'm glad it's there. It just takes me a while to figure it out, you know, if ever.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And like the kind of connection between something like space and time. And I know that in the acknowledgments, you talk about how vampire stories tend to feel like time travel stories. And I thought that was such an interesting idea because even back to this kind of sense of conversion and justice, the conversion that happens to Good Stab. And I think in many cases, the conversion that happens to vampires is one that's not deliberate. They didn't say, hey, I want to be X, Y, and Z. I want to be a vampire. I want to be, even in something like I was a teenage slasher, which is so much fun, by the way. I want to ask a few questions about that if we have time. But even there, right, there's this kind of reluctant conversion to being that kind of thing. But then that spans time, right? It just seems to bend space and time for the person who becomes on the other side, whatever it is that they become.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think about that. Like maybe teenage slasher was me practicing for Buffalo Hunter, you know? That's neat. Yeah. And I guess, you know, Jade Daniels she had to accept the mantle of final girl. She did not want that. She had to convert, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. When you're talking about how the settlers are coming, settlers coming west, destroying the buffaloes as they go, something I was thinking about is just Good Stab has these conversations with either Arthur or Catman, I think at some points too, right? About borders and how the Blackfeet are believing in borders that they recognize, but that others do not recognize. The trappers don't recognize or respect. And like, we like to think of that as historical horror, right? Like that's something that happened once and we're kind of done with it. But all you have to do is turn on the news and we see it all of the time. Like people are not respecting borders, whether it's in Ukraine with Russia, whether it's in Palestine with Israel. That seems to be like part of the ongoing horror for Good Stab in this novel, right? Like that this is his home that people are taking from him and he doesn't quite seem to understand why they're just coming in and doing this. And like, I mean, it's not like, obviously we've seen this concept work through before, but for Good Stab, watching him work through this realization or like kind of retrospectively working through this realization in his confessions with Arthur, it's like, it's really painful at times. And like, I know again, it's historically accurate too. And I'm curious, like with writing a narrative like this, when we think about history, when we think about what, we know that European colonizers, there we go, did, how does that, I think a vampire is perfect for that. I'm sorry, like a vampire is like is like the perfect vehicle for that. So I'm curious, like, how did these two come together in your mind when you're coming together with a narrative like this?
So I hadn't thought about it like that, but yeah, a vampire has a kind of long view that can wrap its head around that kind of stuff, I think Goodstab, I'm not sure he would have realized it in what would have been his normal lifetime. Born in 1833, dies in 1880 or something, But now that he's living longer and longer, yeah, he's keenly aware of it. I wish I could say it was intentional, but really the reason I made him a vampire, I felt like if I did a werewolf, I would have to build it just like I built the werewolves and mongrels. The audience might expect that. And I thought, I don't want to, that seems like a lot of work. I was trying to make stuff up. So I didn't do that. But I knew I wanted some sort of like violent creature, some violent monster, because I wanted the wish fulfillment of coming at these buffalo hunters, these people who are taking down the herds. To tell you the truth, a werewolf is probably going to do that in the daytime, going from embankment to embankment or whatever, and take out one buffalo hunter at a time. That's not dramatic. That's not fun. I think it's a lot more fun or I get a lot more joy, I should say, out of I'm coming at these buffalo hunters when they think they're safe in their camp at night. And the vampire to me is a creature for that, because that's when they operate. It's at night and they're quiet and tough and everything. That's a simple reason. Well, that's one of two simple reasons why Goodstab is a vampire. The other reason is I've never written a vampire novel. I want to see what it was like.
Personally, I will say that I think this is, there are times when I see these cycles of horror characters, and there was a moment, maybe last year, I was like, really? Are we doing vampires again? I don't want to do vampires again. But I think reading the Buffalo Hunter, I'm like, man, there are new ways to think about these stories, and just, like fresh takes on these kinds of ideas. And the ideas here are both big and, like we said, a little bit more confined to like the actual characters that are here.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think I agree that whenever we think a creature, a monster, a horror character is played out, that somebody will luck into a new way to do it. Like I remember that movie. I'm gonna guess it's from 2014, but I'm not sure about that. I don't think it was, because that was Warm Bodies. I'm thinking of Oz Zombies. Do you know Oz Zombies? AAH, then Zombies. It's just a kind of like a, I don't know, a coming of age or rom-com zombie story. But periodically the camera flips around such that we're in the zombies' point of view. And it turns out zombies are completely sentient and they're people still. But what they see of humans is we move impossibly fast. We're just like little mice skittering around. They're in slow motion, And so when they talk, it sounds like moaning and everything. And that was such a novel way to do the zombie. It made the zombie feel new to me in a wonderful, wonderful way. It was like Brains in 1985, when Return of the Living Dead gave us that.
Yeah, these Copernican revolutions of horror. I mean,
yeah, exactly, man.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
All right, Jeff, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask a really kind of a weird question. And by weird, I mean, I'm a dumb philosopher, and I'm sorry for this question in advance. I've been reading a lot of stuff about how confession works, and not necessarily in a religious context, but just confession generally. We have this idea that confession is a kind of mode of getting the truth out of things, right? I need you to confess or whatever. Like the person goes to maybe the Lutheran minister or to the Roman Catholic priest and says, hey, I'm going to confess. I'm going to give you the truth. But that the confession is this like forcing out of truth or something like that. And it's interesting to me that it seems as though Goodstab thinks that he's maybe going to a Roman Catholic priest, because Arthur has to kind of keep reminding him that this is he's a Lutheran pastor. He could have gotten married. He could have done, all these different things. Okay. Here's where it takes a left turn. And again, I'm sorry for this. So the scientific revolution, right? Post-Enlightenment, we had these ideas that what we're going to do through science is we're going to get the natural world to confess to us. We're going to get its secrets out. But this ultimately ends up kind of putting everything into little boxes. So confession is actually a way of saying, oh, you're just a thing. You're just a taxonomized thing. Whether or not it's like you're a mammal or you're a sinner, that's what confession does. And so when I was reading this story, the Buffalo Hunter, I kept thinking like, this is a weird confession story because it flips all of this on its head. And again, I don't know, maybe I'm just out here and you did a really good job of like towing the line between a good literature professor and horror author saying, I'm no intent here. I don't know. I had this wild kind of these thoughts alongside, right, what Goodstab is doing, what Arthur Bocarn is doing, and then even what Etsy is doing. Because what Etsy seems to be doing is trying to kind of bring this in to the academic setting, and it just always explodes in her face. It always exceeds. And so, if you have thoughts about that, love to hear them. If not, I just want to say, like, this is such an incredibly rich story. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I think confession can work like talk therapy, basically like you and someone else each have one end of a washcloth and you're wringing it to get that one drop of truth out, I feel like, yes, this can happen. I do. And also, yes, we all, not all, but I think most of us are some version of Linnaeus or even Maxwell's demon. We're trying to organize, taxonomize, put it in this, and we want to, it's like we're telephone operators, we want to put all the cables in the right place, and that feels very good. Until we have one more cable, then we have a hole, then it gets to be an issue. Initially, I thought that this was going to be an actual confession story I thought it was going to be a Jesuit. I didn't really understand what a Jesuit was. I had to look that up in Wikipedia or somewhere. And I think I figured out that it was like the missionary arm of the Catholics or something like that. And I thought, did they even have churches? And that seemed like too much research to do. So what I did instead of that was I looked up what churches were built when in Miles City, where this story was set, Miles City, Montana. And it turned out that Lutheran church popped up right when I needed it to pop up. And so that's why Arthur became Lutheran. I know nothing about Lutheranism. I had to do actually some research on that, and that was not fun. But the way I read Goodstab when he says I want to make my confession is, yes, Goodstab does feel guilty for at least one of the things he's done. Really, really guilty for that. It was an ends justifying the means moment. But I mean, is that really ever justification? I don't think it is. But all the same, I feel like he held that word confession out to a priest, and that's the one thing a priest has to bite on. That's how he could keep Arthur there in that pew listening. This is the usual mechanism that happens between parishioners and priests, pastors, whatever. And so I think Arthur initially doesn't realize how like rhetorically devious Goodstab is, and he wishes he had learned it earlier.
Sorry, Brian. I didn't know if you had more questions. I was gonna jump in. So I was gonna jump in with this.
Yeah, please do.
I just maybe getting back to like the vampire element and how you are iterating on this. These vampires like aren't the vampires from something like Interview with a Vampire or something like Midnight Mass or the Interviews with a Vampire, like the new TV series. Like they aren't, because they're on in this frontier area. They're in this. It's not Europe. It's not some urbanized city somewhere, and so they kind of don't have that super refined, often read as like gay element to them. But at the same time, like as you just said, Goodstab is rhetorically very refined. Like he is going through and just running Arthur through this trap. But it's really fun to see how it develops as you're reading it, because you get, when you're reading, you're kind of always playing detective in a way. You're like, what's going to happen next? What's happening here? And I mean, that was really fun to see, guessing what's Goodstab going to do, and then some of the things he did, some of the things he didn't. But I just think seeing a vampire from this perspective, I really appreciated what you had to say about how a vampire is a scarier creature coming at night in some ways than a werewolf that might just hunt in a pack during the day in this way. I guess I don't want to get into spoilers, so I won't ask a question that I'm just going to swallow there for a second. But one of the other issues, so Brian's talking about confession, talking about maybe the philosophical side here. As a lapsed Catholic, I can talk about confession, but I don't want to talk about confession. It's why I'm primarily lapsed. But beyond that, with Arthur, with Goodstab, with some of the other characters, I mean, maybe some of the minor characters like Dove, there's something about stewardship that I see happening throughout this book. Like, people are in charge of certain things and they feel like they're a steward of them. And Etsy kind of gets this too with the journal when it comes into her possession. And that seems to just run across all the different characters in the novel here. And I think like
Yeah.
whereas confession is us telling others that things that we've done or trying to like, as you say, wring out that bit of truth if we both are at either end of the washcloth.
Mhm.
It seems to be like the idea of who gets to make decisions and who gets to set what's right and who gets to choose what we do. And
Mhm.
I think, I guess we see that a lot in Good Stab, but it's like Good Stab's kind of educated about that along the way too, throughout the novel. So I don't know
Mhm.
if
Mhm.
anything I said there made any sense at all, but if you have any thoughts there, I'd be happy to hear
Yeah.
them.
No, that's I had not thought of it like that, but you're right. Because yeah, Good Stab kind of takes on the role, the mantle, the duty of, steward of the land, the tribe, the herd, and also justice. I guess he feels like that's his duty to fulfill that. I like that. I wonder. I'm trying to think if stewardship is always voluntary. I guess it's not. Like I'm thinking about how, I don't know, like in a family of 15 kids, the dad suddenly is gone, the oldest sister will usually become like a second mom. And that's not a role that she asked for. But because she is there, she becomes like the steward of all her little siblings. I don't think it's quite like that for Good Stab. I suspect that Good Stab kind of dresses himself up as more noble than he is, more righteous than he is, because, tell you the truth, there probably is some way he could kill himself, rather than feed on his people like he has to. But I am always keenly aware of how America, not just America, the world really, is always wanting to make American Indians the stewards of the forest, like we're elves. But that's really nice to make us elves because then we're fantasy creatures and then we don't exist. And isn't that convenient, So I'm always aware of that dynamic for sure.
Yeah, I mean, like I'm thinking of that commercial, like late 80s, early 90s
Mhm.
of the one Native American guy with like the tear coming down his face, and they
Yeah.
used it for pushing recycling and like,
Yeah.
anti-trash campaigns that were on televisions all the time. And
Yeah. Yeah.
it's like, I'm glad, well, glad's the wrong word, but it's interesting to hear you say this, like where like, if they just made Native Americans elves, then they
Mhm.
wouldn't be real. It need to be
Mhm.
something in a Tolkien novel, like where we're just making them
Mhm.
up to talk about the evils of industrialization.
Yeah.
Is that a guilt thing, you think? Like, people are trying to use this to like assuage their own guilt for the awful ways in which Native Americans have been treated? Like
It could be. I mean, it could be. It's a kind of a way of ushering us into the heaven of a fantasy realm. It feels like, which I think people might feel like, oh, we're being nice, we're being respectful, but it's really just more violence. I feel like.
yeah,
But it's funny you mentioned Tolkien because in Lord of the Rings, I think there's two different stewards, and both of those are terrible people.
Steward of Gondor is pretty awful. Oh, that's a great scene in the movie, like when he's
Yeah.
chomping down on cherry tomatoes, which gross.
I don't know what you're just saying there. Also, for some reason, brings me back to that idea of confession because it feels as though the
Mhm.
guilt often requires confession. And Jeff, we'll stop talking about it. Just we'll get away from
Mhm.
confession here. I promise. But there's a sense often I think where confession is just a mechanism for making oneself feel better,
Yeah.
and like that idea that this is confession is just kind of a burying some idea that
Mhm.
there's a complexity there. And so this goes back to that kind of question about the ecology thing where it's not all nature. It's not all ecologies. This is like this land, these people right here, this confined story can tell something bigger. But like right now, it's like
Mhm.
these people are individual. And again, that breaks that kind of taxonomization. It's like we're not just these kind of these categories. We're like individuals that are rich in their own in their
Yeah.
own way.
And also talking confession as it applies to vampires. Anyways, vampires are nearly always either long lived or immortal, one of the two. We don't really know. We don't live long enough to know, probably. But you would, even if you are not someone who feeds on other people, if you live 300 years, you're going to have some sort of pressure release valve, like a confession mechanism to just unburden yourself, or else how are you going to deal? How are you going to cope? Because you step on flowers, you don't give money to this or that homeless person, and that all builds up. And I mean, I'm not saying that we need to be able to clean that off ourselves, but I'm also saying that if we don't, then how do we even move forward?
Yeah, something that you said earlier too, just about stripping away like all the good things for Good Stab. There's also the sense that like the hope of community is stripped away.
Mhm.
It doesn't feel as if
Mhm.
there is a time where we can imagine Good Stab being part of something that he desperately misses.
Mhm. No, for sure. Yeah. That was the most important thing for me, to strip away from him, to put him in the biggest bind I could. Yeah.
So Jeff, I want to tee up you had a good question, I think, about community. I want to tee you up there if you don't mind jumping into that, if you're up for that.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I'm gonna just my brain's very broken from graduate school and probably having a PhD for too long, piled higher and deeper, as they say. But when we talk about community, I think about Benedict Anderson's imagined communities, and his concept of imagined communities is this idea that borders, like national borders, aren't real. Like there's lines that we've drawn somewhere, and they're agreed upon or not. Like I sort of mentioned earlier. Good stab, just going through this, like we said, like you said. I wonder, like, is community, and whether imagined or real, always part of horror? Like in the idea of how we see horror acting out, playing out between different characters in different segments of populations. Because I think we see it in mongrels a bit too, honestly, like with how there's in groups and out groups, even just in like neighborhoods. So like, what, first part of the question, how, as a horror creator, as a horror author, how do you think about community when you're building stories like this in that way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure if community is always a part of horror, but I think community is often, like, you're walking through your day, you pulled into a horror adventure, you have to make decisions X, Y, and Z. And I think in the back of your mind is always, how are these decisions I make now to survive this horror ordeal gonna work or not work for the community I have to step back into? Like, what did I do to get my hands dirty? Are they gonna see my hands now? I think that's part of it, but I mean, I think like Waiting for Godot, I think to me that's horror as well. And you're pretty isolated in that kind of stuff. Or even like Solaris, Dennis Foss, that's just him in a big ocean mind or something. His community in that case, I guess, is his memories, right? So I guess he does have community. I don't know if I consciously think about community, but I do think just mechanically writing a novel, it's so much easier if there is a community, because then all the burden to deliver exposition and externalize things is not on a single character. I mean, there's writers who can make that work. Nicholson Baker does it with the mezzanine, pretty much. But I think I could pull off something like that. But at the same time, I want it to be fast paced and fun. And it's hard to do fast paced and fun without community, for me, anyways. But
Yeah,
I'm not really engaging it in a sense you were talking about community. I'm engaging it more from a craft or technique perspective, I think.
yeah, sure. I mean, that's great though, because that sort of builds the second part of my question, which was in the acknowledgement section of Buffalo Hunter x Hunter. You talk about books and authors who inspired this book, and so how do you see community in this sense? Like where we have, to my mind, I'm biased, admittedly, but I think often horror authors seem to work within their community and to raise each other up in their communities, perhaps more than other genres. So like, in this sense, do you see horror building community, not just with authors, but also with readers and other folks?
Yeah, I do. And I think it does. And I think I would actually substitute solidarity for community in that sense, but I think solidarity is kind of like a fundament of community, so it's all on a spectrum or on a gradient or something. But I think that solidarity you get in horror is like, you see the party, you're at a circus, at a fairgrounds, and you look in and you see all the Ferris wheels and the hammer spins and the big tent, and there's lights over there and people having fun eating cotton candy, clown. You're standing out at the fence, leaning on it, looking through, and you realize there's somebody standing beside you, and they also have the same black t-shirt on you've got, and you're like, hey, we're both out here. And you realize that you don't know this person, but you do know this person, and you'll stand by each other. And I do think you're right that horror creators tend to lift each other up. What I've found more than other genres or modes. Yes. And I don't think it's necessarily about competition or about some sort of like limited amount in the food bowl. It's not necessarily about that. It's just about being an outsider, and you generally, like, you'll stand up for an outsider if you're an outsider before you'll stand up for somebody else, I think.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And Jeff, why I really like this question is because one of the things that really prompted this whole kind of venture into joy and horror is seeing like folks just be alongside each other for this kind of journey. I met Paul Tremblay in Rhode Island, and just kind of talking to him and seeing how it seems like you and he and a few other horror authors have this kind of really cool friendship, it feels like there's something so joyful there that when you peer into like that community, it just feels like people don't realize the joy that you get from building these things alongside each other. I want to use that if I can to pivot towards something like these slasher books that you have written recently. My Heart is a Chainsaw, absolutely loved it. And, you know, I was a teenage slasher. I just read that. And I think there's something about this that, right, the connection here is that both Jade and Tolly, not Tolly, I'm forgetting. Well, I'm forgetting the person in my gosh, I was a teenage slasher, Amber.
Tolly and Amber.
Yeah. So Amber has this knowledge, right, of the history of horror, and Jade has this knowledge of the history of horror, and it kind of brings you in, right? It brings you along. It's this expansive story, and it kind of just, I think, like you're saying, there's comfort, strangely, in this kind of history of horror. And I'm not even sure there's a question in here, but I think I want to kind of follow up on Jeff's question about community and just kind of, you know, ask something about how those histories together, right? You kind of answered this with the person next to you having the same shirt, but just to highlight it more, like it just feels like what you're writing here is something like an invitation, right? It's like an invitation to come alongside. It's not the cool kids. It's like the people that are just interested in this thing, and we want to kind of just live in those worlds, sometimes safely. And yeah, so I don't know. Again, question in there. I'm not sure. I'll just throw it to you. See if you have thoughts about any of that.
Well, with the Indian Lake trilogy, I'd have to balance that, what you're talking about, of if you know this stuff, great, let's go for a ride. I had to balance that with, if you're new to this stuff, you're welcome, you know, because I don't want to be like the comic book guy in The Simpsons who's chiding everyone who comes in for not knowing what happened in Iron Man number 310 or something. You know, that's not the way you get your club bigger. And actually, it's not a club that you want exactly, I don't think, because it starts to have like admission requirements or some sort of threshold of knowledge you've got to qualify. And pretty soon you've got secret handshakes and a gate and everything. That doesn't do anybody any good, you know, I don't think. So yeah, how to be inclusive, but how to also pull off some in-jokes that will endear you to the diehards, you know, it's a real balancing act. And you're not going to satisfy everyone. That's what you got to figure. That's what you got to understand immediately when you start trying to do something like this, is not everyone's going to be happy, you know, but maybe they'll be happy enough they keep reading, you know?
Yeah. No, I'll say, like, I think you do that incredibly well in all three of those books, but also in I Was a Teenage Slasher. So
Thank you.
Jeff, if you don't mind, can I follow this up with a question about I Was a Teenage Slasher? I think the thing that it just kind of, the joy bloomed when I realized that the relationship between somebody like Goodstab as a vampire and Tolly as a slasher was really close. There was a sense in which what you did is you created a world in which the rules of something like a werewolf or a vampire seem to apply to the slasher, which made it this interesting thing. And it goes back to that early claim you made here that Jason doing what he does, you want Jason to enact whatever nature is Jason's nature. And there's something joy about that, something joyful about that. And so following Tolly along, he's reluctant, but you also see that he's like following into these kinds of, I don't know if it's an essentialization, but it's like the same kind of story where he's drawn up into it and takes on this thing. So didn't know if you saw, again, I'm sorry, coming back to this confession. Tolly is this Tolly confessing to Amber, or, you know, whomever, like, you know, what's going on here. But yeah, thought I just wanted to get some slasher stuff in here because those books are just so much fun.
Thank you. No, I do see, like, Tolly, he is doing direct address to different people in the text. So it's like sometimes he'll be talking to his mom, sometimes he's talking to Amber, and, you know, he changes like that. But I do feel like he is unburdening his soul in some fashion over this long. People call it a memoir sometimes, and maybe it is a memoir, but if it is a memoir, to me, it is in the confessional mode, because he does feel guilt for what he has, you know, done, and that's not left him that guilt.
Yeah, I will also say, sorry, Jeff, I want to hear what you have to say, that those scenes with the peanut allergy were really hard for me. My son has an allergy. And so, like, all those scenes, especially when he's kind of being initiated into his slasher role, with the peanut stuff. That stuff hits me because of that. But yeah, Jeff.
Well, I wouldn't say good, but terrible. But I'm glad it connected anyways.
Yeah, and I'm the jerk that almost once killed Brian's kid with an egg allergy. So that's it's we can laugh because he's fine. Yeah. At the time, it wasn't great, but and so I mean, I love talking about community and horror, and like what Brian was talking about with the slasher trilogy reminded me of how so many, or the slasher. I was teenage slasher, not the trilogy. So many people, when you try to get them to read horror or to engage with horror, are like, oh, I don't like horror. It's it's too bloody and it's too gross. But like horror, to my mind, and any of these subgenres that are kind of speculative fiction in their way, with like, you know, maybe fantasy, maybe like magical realism, that sort of stuff. There's so many possibilities with genres like these. And I think horror is such a fun playground to see the kaleidoscope of human experiences. And some people just don't want to, like, they're not interested in that. So, I mean, I'm guessing you probably don't have to do this too frequently, but if you were trying to sell horror to someone, like, what is it? Because we're having a lot of fun talking about this. We have joy with horror on this podcast. How do you get people who are hesitant or resistant to horror to buy in?
Yeah, you try to lure them in by saying there's only two genres that intentionally provoke or try to provoke a visceral or a physical response, and it's horror and erotica. You know, the rest of it kind of is intellectual, cerebral. It can be, anyways. You know, but the trick is, I think the issue is getting over people's thresholds, because what some people may call terrifying happened in a Ian McEwan novel, you know, and other people need a Jack Ketchum novel or Sarah Grant's Come Closer or something to feel that same level of terror, I guess. So, tell you the truth, when I am in a situation where I'm supposed to lure somebody over to horror, I'm also warning them away at the same time. But I think that also functions as an invitation. Like when you tell a kid this book isn't for you, you know they're going to sneak around and read that book, you know? Yeah. So as much as you might try to keep people safe, I think the more you try to do that, the more that they will come over to horror side. Once they just realize that there's a beating heart in it, you know, that's the hard part to get. And what I love about horror is how it fast forwards over so much stuff that other novels have to spend 180 pages on. Because with horror, you know the stakes within 20 pages, and everything is hyped up to 10 or 11. It's almost melodrama, you know, and which is to say the characters are immediately in a pressure cooker, and that's when we know characters the best. And I think that's what people want from stories. I mean, we want reversal, we want rhythm, we want up and down, but like Vonnegut says, all that. But we want to get to know people, and you get to know people the best when they're in that pressure cooker, and horror puts them in a pressure cooker immediately.
Sure, absolutely. It's something I really appreciate about the genre, like what you're saying, where some other genres you would get 180 pages of exposition, or like, I mean, we've already talked about Tolkien earlier, but how he'll describe the heath on the hill for about 3 pages, and at some point you're like, I get it, the hill heath, and it's quite beautiful, but can we please move on? Or I mean, I think I saw on Blue Sky the other day, you had a picture with a fan wearing a Thomas Pynchon t-shirt, and I have been stuck trying to read Against the Day for going on 16 years. It is a brick of a book, and it's really cool, and it's really interesting, but man, like sometimes it's just very slow. And I mean, sometimes I will have this issue with Stephen King. I think Stephen King, his books are very long, and I say this as an English professor, I sometimes struggle reading long books. So King can be that way. Audiobooks, Brian introduced me to the gloriousness that is audiobooks. I do sometimes like this, hearing that storytelling aspect in the audiobook, how that comes through really clearly. Like we just did an episode on John Darnielle's Universal Harvester, and hearing the storytelling qualities in his books, hearing the storytelling qualities in your books. Like I really appreciate that. And I think that's something that horror does well with the storytelling, because like you're saying, we got to see these people in these scenarios where it is a pressure cooker, and we need to understand why they're doing what they're doing quickly, because there's other things that are going to happen too.
I totally agree. And I think that what you're talking about, like hearing the story, which doesn't necessarily mean like auditorily hearing it, just like hearing it with your mind, kind of. I think that just gets us back to the very first stories that were ever told around a campfire, 15, 20, 60,000 years ago, whatever it was. Because I feel confident that the story that would grip 10 people around a campfire is a story of the hunt you just went on 3 valleys over. And you kind of exaggerate whatever animals you saw, and you exaggerate the trees and the cliffs and everything, and you do the sound effects and the shadows. And I think that's where, I mean, that's not where horror was born. Horror was born the first time something tried to eat us, probably, you know. But I think horror storytelling starts with us recounting stuff around the fire like that, because we weren't telling stories about, you know, remember when my dad cheated on my mom when I was 12 and how that derailed the rest of my life? You know, that's not very interesting around a campfire. Well, what is interesting is a monster.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, everything you're saying about storytelling and about how this works in horror, I think part of this makes me think of Noel Carroll's claim that what horror does is really pull at emotions, and what you're doing is you're in many ways following the emotional journey of the characters. And so, like, this is a huge pull into horror, is that this is an emotive, emotional, like you said, visceral kind of genre. And it's, I think there's something really incredible about how that works. I kind of think of maybe rom-coms as like a kind of horror here, because it makes you want to fall in love with the character. So if the character's falling in love, maybe you're falling in love too. But in horror, it's very different.
You know, for a long time, I've been trying to convince people that I'm in a slasher follow basically the same story beats. It's just what's gore and one is cute in another, you know. But I think Josh Rubin's Hard Eyes kind of maybe has proven to everybody how similar rom-com and the slasher is.
Yeah, that's good. I keep making the argument that, in fact, Willy Wonka and the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is actually just a slasher. He's just picking off the kids one by one.
He is, isn't he? Yeah, definitely. That's a good point. He's kind of like Dr. Phibes. You know?
I wanted to ask, right, we're talking about joy and horror, and you are obviously in tune and attuned to the horror genre in many ways. If there's anything recently that you have found that has brought you joy in the horror genre, you know, any kind of narrative, be it movie, film, you know, whatever.
Yeah, you know, I think the last time I felt that kind of horror joy or joy in horror would probably be a month or two ago. Maybe, I guess this is the end of December, actually. So it's 3 or 4 months probably. I read Virginia Fato's Victorian Psycho, and that was just full of horror joy for me. It's this woman who is carving through an estate, and just there's blood on every wall, and she is so heartless and fun, and you trust that there's a reason for this as you're going through. And it's really short, fast, fun, punchy. I can't recommend it enough. So that's probably the last time I felt that. Before that, in a novel, it probably would be Mayfly by C.J. Lee. It's a very similar story. It's about a woman just carving through Los Angeles, basically. That was really cool to me. Not because I have a beef against Los Angeles. It's just a really fun story, you know? As far as film, maybe the last time I really felt that joy, it might have been Happy Death Day, you know? I really thought that brought it in a good way. Christopher Landon does it. He did it with Freaky too, I think. He's pretty good. I'm excited for whatever he does next. Before that, the probably biggest joy I felt in horror might have been Cabin in the Woods. Yeah, that had it. But there's also short films. I think for me, the pinnacle of joy in horror is a short film called The Legend of Beaver Dam. I'm not sure what year it's from. It's 12 minutes long. It's not streaming free. You have to buy it for $2.99 or something, but it is. I don't want to spoil it for y'all, but there's musical elements. It's so bloody, and it's just so fun. And somehow it engages that gear where there's all kinds of terrible stuff happening, but it doesn't lodge in you, you know, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I'm always on the lookout for short horror stuff, especially film. A lot of times, so I teach a film class, and my students often are like a little bit, they're reluctant, right? Some of them are into horror, and the others are like, no, thank you. So if I can sneak in those like shorts, that can get them.
You know, well, one good sneak in that regard would be Spider by Noah Edgerton. I think that's his name. It's on Vimeo. It's 7 minutes long, I believe. That'll sneak up on people who think they aren't into horror, you know?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Definitely going to take these and put them on a list, high on the list. Yeah, for sure. I have a question about basketball. I don't know. Yeah. Basketball makes its way into your stories a lot. I see the basketball on the back there. I love basketball, and so I'm always delighted when these two things come together, horror and basketball. So what's your relationship with basketball?
You know, I grew up playing ball. I think I started in 7th grade, I guess. I didn't make the team that year, but I made it all the years after. I think I was in high school. We had a new coach come in, and he said, no more of this. Like every year at the end of the season, when the JV season would go over and varsity was pushing on the regionals or something, they'd the coach would pull up a player or two from JV to just sit on the bench in varsity, to get some experience, the stars of tomorrow or whatever. And
Yeah.
he said, no more of that. We're not doing it anymore. We're a better program. But sure enough, I got pulled up on the varsity. And then I went to Colorado Springs, the Air Academy High, when I was 17, a junior year. It was a team that had won state multiple times, and they were expected to win state again this year, and they did end up going undefeated and winning state. And so the lecture we all got was, this team is for seniors only, but then I made that team as a JV player, and I got kicked off because of absences, but I made it, and I loved basketball, and I played it all through college, every pickup game I could find, intramurals. I kept playing once I became a professor when I was 28, playing against my students, having fun. But as happens in, I guess, my mid-30s, I blew my knee out. I had to get ACL, microfracture, meniscus surgery. Then 2 or 3 years after that, I ruptured my Achilles twice in a row. And the result of all these surgeries and recoveries was that I felt like I was missing writing time. It was all like the Vicodin was stealing away my mind, so I couldn't put novels down on the page. And I told myself I had to make a decision. Is it going to be basketball or fiction? And so I chose fiction. I figured that can see me through the years a lot better than basketball can, finally. It's hard to grow old with basketball. You can grow old with golf, maybe with tennis, maybe with some other stuff, but basketball is a hard one for me to grow old with anyways, because I always want to play against the 22-year-olds because that's more fun, But
Yeah.
But back in '02, I had tried to write a novel that had basketball as a backbone. The Bird Is Gone, and I don't think I did it. It ended up being a different kind of novel. And then I tried once more. I forget where. Somewhere in all the books. I tried again, and I didn't pull it off. And I wasn't able to do basketball on the page like I did in The Only Good Indians. I was far enough from the court to kind of mythologize the sport, if that makes sense. When I was in the midst of playing it, then I couldn't get on the page the right way. But once I quit playing, I was able to get it on the page. But the trick is, once I did it, The Only Good Indians, for the whole Indian Lake trilogy, I had to say basketball's off limits. I can't become the dude who only does basketball,
Yeah. No, the distance stuff makes sense, and reading Only Good Indians again recently, like the basketball stuff, it's just an extra layer of joy for me, at least.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I do like watching all the old guys, like you go out and play, and they're just the ones that like they got that old guy strength, just backing you down, or they're like shooting threes, and it's like, where'd this guy come from? He can't move at all, but he's hitting all these threes. Love that.
I know, it's really impressive. And these last few days, I've been watching all these Wilt Chamberlain videos of him coming to the court when he's 50 years old and just dominating people. He's Wilt Chamberlain. I guess he's going to dominate all the time, but still, you don't expect him to beat Magic Johnson, in his prime.
That's right. Well, if there's ever a basketball playing immortal being in your future writing, and I'm going to be first in line, I'll tell you that.
Maybe I write a Marvel comic with a celestial who dribbles through the cosmos or something.
Love that. Yes. Jeff, any final thoughts? Any final questions for Stephen Graham Jones?
No, man, this has been a really great conversation. I appreciate you taking the time. We look forward to what's next. But Buffalo Hunter x Hunter, can't recommend it enough. Anyone that will sit still long enough to have me talk at them, like whether it's the doctor's office, the grocery store, wherever, I'm like, hey, do you like books? Read this book. And our local library here in the small town I live in, they got a copy of it. And I was going to check it out to read it, like the physical copy. And someone got it before me. And I've never been happier in my life to have someone swoop in and get a book out before me. So it's been really great to talk to you again, and we can't thank you enough.
Thank you, man. It's been great talking to y'all. It's wonderful. I was an undergrad philosophy major, so I usually don't get to talk about this kind of stuff anymore. So it's a blast.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing it. This has been absolutely incredible. Jeff, maybe you should become a dentist so that you can get people just to like sit there with their mouth open. You can tell them whatever you want about the books that you love.
Yeah. Yeah.
A real live horror for Jeff would be being a dentist. Like, here, open your mouth. Let me just poke around in here. This is great.
And for your patients. And for your patients too, I think.
No, I'm barely a functional English professor. Imagine dentist work.
Well, thank you again so much for your time, for your incredible, thoughtful answers, for all of your work. I have not read a thing of yours that I have not just wanted to tell everybody about. So thank you for that. Thank you for your words, for your work, all of it.
Thank you. And I hope we all keep finding joy in horror.
This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.